Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me from the Shenandoah Valley is the chair of the Emerging Civil War editorial board, John Tracey. John, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing just great, Chris. How about you?
I'm hanging in there. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted for the chance to finally sit down and talk to you about the first book that has your name on the front cover.
Well, I had to do it, right?
Civil War Monuments in Memory, part of the Emerging Civil War 10th Anniversary Series. And I had the privilege to work with John on that book. And John, first of all, just congratulations on having your first publication like that. I know it's not your first publication, but you get your name on a book for the first time. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was a real big deal to get that box in from the publisher, open it up, and be on the cover, not just in the table of contents. Table of contents is great. I love putting stuff that's in the table of contents, but having it on the cover too is for the first time is a special feeling.
Yeah, and it's something I hope the excitement never wears off for you, because for me it's still a thrill after all these years, and I hope it always remains one for you. And I hope this is the first of many, and it's a solid first outing. So, tell me a little bit about the book and how you feel about it.
Yeah, so it's part of that 10th anniversary series, which lots of the podcast listeners have heard about, and hopefully have a couple on the shelves. Where we've just kind of tried to thematically pair together all kinds of blog posts and long form essays and symposia and all kinds of other stuff that have just been generated over the last 10 years of emerging Civil War. This one, we tried to kind of really circle in on monuments and memory of the Civil War, which obviously is something that a lot of people have a lot of things to say about, both in kind of the academic world and the public history world and in just the average person world. Especially in the last couple of years, just about everybody has thought about that, at least for a little while, to some extent. So we had a lot of really interesting content to pull from. It's not the same way as an academic press book where it's all of the monuments. It's all about these big picture concepts across the entire United States. This is just full of smaller essays with deeper dives into certain individuals or certain monuments. So I think there's a lot of value in that to kind of get the micro history of a whole bunch of just little stories that tell us something about the bigger picture, but really focus in on one town's local monument or one monument on a battlefield or one particular veteran's memoirs. I think there's a lot of value in that.
And one of the things to me that I thought was fascinating about the project was that, by taking that approach, like here's a whole bunch of stuff for you, the reader, to think about. And we don't necessarily tell you what to think, but like, here's just some stuff to think about so you can start to think about it yourself and grapple with these things. And to me, that makes it a much more engaging volume than just blah, 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 blah. As you curated these pieces, and I'll explain to folks that, kind of as John and I approached this book, I asked him to do the first draft to just like pull together the pieces that you think are really thought-provoking or interesting or have something to say. And as you went through that curatorial process, John, kind of what was going through your mind and how did you evaluate pieces as you were doing your picking and choosing?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to do coming into it was have a diverse amount of authors and a diverse amount of perspectives on a diverse amount of topics. There's a lot of monuments at Gettysburg. I didn't want a book that was just about 30 different monuments at Gettysburg. I'm sure there's a niche for that, and we have Gettysburg pieces in here. I wrote at least one of them, and they're great pieces, but I didn't want just a book full of battlefield monuments. I didn't want just a book full of courthouse monuments. I didn't want just a book about memoirs. I wanted something that had a little bit of all of that. And we had pieces, or we approached authors about writing pieces that fit through that. And I think we came out with a lot of really unique sections. I mean, two that come to mind when I was thinking about for the podcast here. Towards the beginning, we've got pieces by artists about how they look at monuments. We have Michael Krause. His foreword's great because he's a sculpture artist who has done repairs to original Civil War monuments. And that's such a neat perspective to get the idea behind monuments and what they mean to him from somebody who's out there, repairing pieces that are broken. That pairs really nicely with our good friend Chris Heisey, who does all of our wonderful photography, and to have a piece about what it's like for him to go out on a battlefield in all kinds of weather. I mean, there's all kinds of pictures. He tells us all kinds of stories of going out, right at the crack of dawn, like it's hailing sideways. He's like, I got to go get a picture of that monument because this is a perspective. And that second batch is towards the end of the book, where we think about non-traditional monuments, and we have that piece by Cecily Zander about a city as a monument. Now it's got a regular monument in it too, but a town named after a general as a monument. Sharita's article on sugar kettle art, Dave Dixon on the trees named after generals. That's a monument. How cool is that? And just those concepts of, we've got the traditional monument stories in here too, but getting in some of these other concepts that maybe people don't think of as monuments, but serve very similar purposes and fill that same niche.
And to me, that's one of the things that I think is really important about the book and about a monument conversation in general, is just helping people understand, what a monument is and how a monument on a battlefield is different than one in a courthouse versus one that is on someone's private property. And those different contexts also affect meaning, which a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah, and of course we got a great piece by Chris White about what is a monument, right at the beginning of the book, kind of, just coming right out, right towards the beginning, be like, hey, we're just going to talk about all the different kinds of monuments and all the different periods that they're going up and all the different things that they might mean, just because there's so many that people might not have thought of. And we do, have a pretty good spread of those courthouse monuments, and how they are maybe a little different than battlefield monuments, and how battlefield monuments can be different because of all the different eras that they're going up in. Dan Welch has a great piece on Gettysburg about that, kind of looking at the earliest forms of monumentation and how they're changing from the veterans that start to put them up as early as the end of the 1860s to obviously the really big boom in the 1880s, and how it kind of starts to trickle on off into the early 1900s and changes, as the veteran generation grows older, wants to visit with their families, and then eventually passes away. And then the monumentation kind of moves into that descendant generation. Mm-hmm. That changes a lot of the dynamic there. And it's something worth tracking out, to see a monument and kind of think about, okay, when did this go up? Did this go up, right after the war? Did this go up in the great height of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Army Veterans Association in like the 1880s? Or did this go up, as that generation was thinning out in the 1900s? It's something always to, and I think that's something that I hope this book makes people think about, as they go through and find a town monument in the North or in the South in this book, and read through all the primary sources that our authors found about dedication speeches and planning documents. And, maybe it inspires them to think about some monument, whether in their town or just somewhere that they like to visit, and think about that and see if they can find some of those answers for themselves. Be like, okay, I've seen this monument a bunch of times. It's right in the downtown of where I live. I wonder what they were thinking when they dedicated. I wonder what year it went up. I wonder what they said in the dedication speeches. I wonder who gave those speeches. Is it anybody that I might have known? Was it the governor? Was it the mayor? Was it a veteran?
And when you talk about the veterans, people sort of assume like, oh, the veteran put this up, and that has particular meaning. And of course it does. But, I think of the Hazen Monument at Stones River, which gets put up while the war is still going on to commemorate the loss of those men at a particular spot on the battlefield, versus monuments veterans may have put up later at Gettysburg or at Spotsy that, well, we want people to think we were in this spot, as opposed to maybe over here where we really were. And so, they commemorate a particular landscape to tell a particular story that may or not be true, but it's the way they want to be remembered. And that's a lot different. And it's not as sacrosanct as people might think the veterans might be.
Yeah, I mean, those wartime monuments do definitely hold a very special spot. Both the Hazen Monument, we have a piece in here about Manassas. Manassas has a wartime monument to a Confederate general that does not make it to the end of the war. And then they have kind of those immediate post-war monuments where there's, a bunch of Union soldiers in uniform at the dedication of the monument as they're on their way north to muster out. It's one of my favorite photographs of the battlefield, just to see these end of war veterans, and their uniforms are all kind of wacky. They don't look like anybody looked like at the Battle of First Manassas. They don't look like July of 1861 anymore, because these guys have been running around for years. And they're there in front of this monument that you can visit today. But getting to some of those veteran debates, we got a lot of that in there too. Those ideas of when the monuments are telling you something that's maybe a little bit different than the established historical record. The most famous of which that we touch on in a couple pieces here being the 72nd Pennsylvania Monument at the angle at Gettysburg. Even if the word 72nd Pennsylvania doesn't come to listeners' minds, it's the one with the Zouave holding his rifle up, at the angle, to repulse Pickett's charge. I mean, it's on the Gettysburg National Military Park commemorative quarter. Oh, it's on the back of that. And it's probably the most photographed monument on the battlefield, because everybody's out there and, the sun is setting and you can get that shot with the sunset and the big dramatic action pose monument. But there was a legal case because the veterans wanted to put the monument up against the stone wall, and the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, who was running the battlefield at that point and established the rules for monumentation, wanted it further back, marking where the regiment's initial line of battle was. There's a whole big thing, and obviously the veterans of that regiment won against other Union veterans who were arguing against them. But it's that idea that all these monuments are trying to tell some kind of story or convince you of something. And this isn't a dig on the 72nd Pennsylvania's veterans. Maybe that is the way that they remembered it. When they look back at the Battle of Gettysburg, they remembered a certain thing, because if you're a private in the ranks, there's that idea that all you're really seeing is like directly in front of you. Right. And they are engaged in the repulse of Pickett's charge. They take casualties doing so. And so, when those veterans are arguing for their position against the stone wall in the way that they remember themselves being involved in Pickett's charge, I'm not calling them liars. I'm just saying that, then the other Union veterans that are arguing other points to them and saying, hey, they were further back, they were assigned a little to the rear of our regiment, they didn't go all the way up to the stone wall, because that's the way that the other veterans remember seeing it. So it's not necessarily anybody's like a bad person or anybody's, a out and out liar. It's just the concept of, hey, it's been a couple of decades. That was probably one of the most chaotic days of their lives, because it was July 3rd, 1863, and they were at the angle repulsing Pickett's charge. I'm not going to blame anybody if they maybe don't remember that perfectly, or if they just didn't see something, because they were under an artillery barrage for quite a while before. And then there's thousands of Confederate soldiers coming directly for them. There are things that they're doing that are not sitting down in the moment writing a diary entry. So if that memory of a very traumatic day and a very traumatic event is maybe a little bit jumbled for them, I'm not going to criticize them too heavily for that.
And there's also what I refer to as the Bruce Springsteen glory days phenomenon, where, as these guys are getting older and older, they're looking back on the good old days, and everything in the good old days was so much better than it is today. And, that patina of sentimentality and nostalgia tends to make events a lot cloudier, even as people think it makes them clearer. And that impacts their ability to kind of see and monument some of these events.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into why Gettysburg is quite potentially the largest collection of outdoor statuary in the world, or at least in the United States. Gettysburg gets seen as that dramatic moment. So there are a lot of Union regiments where, maybe they only have one battlefield monument. And if they only have one, it's probably at Gettysburg, or maybe it's at Antietam. And yes, you can make the argument that part of that is because those two battlefields are easier for them to get to because they're not as far south. And for the idea that those battlefields are the ones that are earlier preserved and available. There's not a lot of monuments on some other battlefields in the South because there's not preserved land where veterans are confident that they can dedicate a monument and it will remain safe and maintained. But it's also because places like Gettysburg and Antietam are seen at the time as these big, major, super important battles. And I'm not going to get into the whole decisive battle, turning point argument or any of that, because all we need to know for the purposes of this book is that the veterans thought they were, and the people of their time thought they were, which meant there are monuments for regiments at Gettysburg who aren't engaged at all or are barely engaged. I mean, case in point, the majority of the Union Sixth Corps.
Right.
There's a lot of monuments to the Sixth Corps at Gettysburg. And I mean, especially when compared to some of the Wilderness Campaign battles, they're not really doing a whole lot at Gettysburg. They're marching really far in a remarkably short amount of time. But once they get to Gettysburg, they're not seeing very heavy combat. But there's a bunch of monuments to the regiment because it's the idea of we want our regimental monument at Gettysburg because we want people to know that we were at Gettysburg.
Yeah, to touch the story was really important, even if they were on the kind of the edges of it.
Yeah, and so maybe that monument is telling the story of the regiment for the whole war, but they wanted it on the Gettysburg battlefield because that was a big deal to them. Even if looking at the regimental casualties, they had a much worse day or a much better combat showing at places like the Wilderness or Spotsylvania or the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah. I think, and that sort of reminds me, using a local example here, the monument for the 154th New York and the Chancellorsville battlefield. It's that half moon crescent shaped monument that's right next to the road. And that doesn't mark the spot where the regiment was, but marks a spot where people would see it as they're driving by. And it also marks a spot where they were, the people who put that monument up were confident that it would stay there because there was a piece of ground where it could stay. And so these are all sorts of different factors that come into a consideration when people are placing these monuments that may or may not have anything to do with where they actually were at a specific time and a specific date, but instead, how are they able to successfully commemorate those actions?
Yeah, I mean, it just a lot of times just comes down to logistics. I mean, and at battlefields, the government would buy directly along the side of a road because they had this idea that those open agricultural fields, they'd always be open agricultural fields. So why do we need to buy that farmer's 80 acres? It was a farm field at the battle. It's a farm field in 1885. It'll just keep being a farm field. We don't need to worry about that. And so they get the monument, they buy the property, and the veterans place the monument right along the side of the road. Maybe that unit in combat action was 30, 40, 50 yards away, but people visiting now without the veterans kind of pointing out, be like, well, our monument's here, but we were actually, on the top of this ridge right over there. Yeah. People will drive by, see the monuments and go, this is exactly where they were. And in some cases, that's true. In some cases, they're maybe off a little bit. Yeah. But that, those ideas of just because it's farmland in 1860, just because it's farmland in 1885, it's not always farmland in 2023. And we do have some pieces on kind of early preservation because that's the same thing. A battlefield is a monument. It's a really big monument of several thousand acres, but it's a monument. Not only does it have monuments on it, but it's a monument. And we have some works in here that start to touch on, those concepts of battlefield preservation, how we got from the 1800s and the early preservation movements. I mean, part of the Gettysburg battlefield is preserved almost immediately following the battle, all the way through today, and the groups that are still working very, very diligently to protect the landscape.
So a lot of people in these discussions about monuments talk about like, oh, you're interfering with history, or you're taking down history if you take down a monument. And there's, a conflation between this idea of history versus memory. You've said several times tonight that a monument tells a particular story. It's the way people want a story to be remembered. And that's different than history. Tell me a little bit about that distinction.
Yeah, I mean they're just not, they're not really the same thing. You have history with kind of standing as, either what actually happened, or at least the common understanding of what actually happened. And then you have, the memory being the way that everybody is looking back at it, thinking about it. And sometimes they're close, sometimes they're not so close. Sometimes, it's like all those monuments we're talking about, where they're maybe not quite in the right spot. Or maybe they're presenting a certain view of the 1860s that's maybe a little bit romanticized, or maybe they're pushing an agenda in the 1920s or in the 1960s, or more recently. I mean, Chris, you've got a piece in the book titled "When a Monument Gets Its History Wrong," and that piece isn't about, concepts of, well, one person remembered it this way and one person remembered it this way, and that's what I'm considering wrong. What your piece is about is, hey, here's this stuff on a monument and it's just straight up not how this worked. It's completely in the wrong spot. There's no period sources or modern historiography or secondary sources that place it anywhere looking like what this monument is saying. If you want to jump in with your piece there.
Yeah, well, here's a couple examples where, there's a UDC monument in Fredericksburg that says the Union Army crossed the river on December 12th. Well, they actually did their river crossing on December 11th. So that's just like a factual inaccuracy. There's another plaque in Fredericksburg that says, here's where Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee met to plan out the Battle of Fredericksburg. And, that's a plaque that is wrong in so many different ways. Jackson and Lee didn't meet. They didn't meet on the dates that's there. That was not a planned battle on Lee's part, but that's the way the UDC wanted that story to be remembered. And Jackson wasn't even the first person there. Longstreet was there before Lee even was. But, God forbid you mention James Longstreet in any sort of UDC text at all in the early days. That was a big no-no. So, it's just like not just cherry picking facts, but then getting them wrong can tell the wrong story.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of comes down to, when those organizations or those people are trying to, establish the way that they remember things. Sometimes it's just wrong. Sometimes it's not a matter of opinion, and there are plenty of situations in which it's a matter of opinion. But sometimes, like you said, it's just them putting something in the wrong spot.
Yeah,
it's them just straight up getting a date wrong. It's them, painting this idea of the Battle of Fredericksburg to glorify Jackson and Lee, when Lee makes some decisions before the Battle of Fredericksburg, but it's also mostly Burnside, and by mostly Burnside I mean mostly Burnside while he's getting yelled at by a bunch of people that are his superiors. And Jackson doesn't have a great day at Fredericksburg.
No.
Yeah, and so here it is, kind of giving Jackson some credit for Fredericksburg when his section of the line does the worst out of all the Confederate generals. And then, like you said, you hinted at the UDC not wanting to give credit to James Longstreet, because James Longstreet's name basically becomes mud after the war for most Confederates, because I don't know quite how to phrase this, whether it's he moves on. He supports many Republican policies. He writes his own memoirs of the war, in which he is sometimes critical of Lee, and all of those decisions come together to make him very much disliked.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, think about the Gettysburg battlefield. Lee gets a monument in the early 1900s. Longstreet doesn't for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And these ideas of who's getting a monument and when and why. And it's the people who are being remembered well and fondly. I mean, during the war, people like Longstreet. During the war, people think Longstreet's doing a pretty good job as a Confederate general. But because of his actions after the war, he's not going to be very popular by the late 1800s. And that's going to change the way that he is remembered in writings and in monuments and on battlefields, just because He's not as popular, so they're not writing about him the same way that they did in 1863.
Yeah. And you know, there are several essays in the book that look at different Lee in different contexts and different Lee statues, you know, and I talk about the one at Antietam, which, you know, it's in a place Lee never was, and the Park Service has inherited this monument as a result, and, you know, not sure what to do with it. And I took some time to just sort of parse out the language that's on that monument, and not even to club people over the head, but just to make the point that, you know, the language you choose for an inscription tells a particular story, and you make choices about what to include and what to leave out. And I created some examples of like, well, they could have included these facts, you know, and not opinions, but they could have included these facts, but chose not to. And it creates a much different version of Lee than what you see up on the horse. Dan Welch has a good one talking about the Virginia Monument at Gettysburg, and just these different portrayals of Lee and the choices that people make as they're creating these statues, as they're dedicating these statues, and as they continue to interpret these statues. They tell very specific stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because monuments don't have a lot of words on them. And so when you have 24 words in an inscription, you got to be real careful about the way you choose those words. And they knew that, and they were. So they're very careful about the way in which they set things up and the way in which they're. And again, I think this is where that Bruce Springsteen glorifying stuff comes in. I mean, being a soldier sucked.
Yeah.
Even if you were a general, it sucked a little less. But then just because you had more physical comforts, you're also making decisions actively every day that are leading to the deaths of, you know, maybe your decision to make a march somewhere gets a couple dozen people killed because of illness. And every decision you make on a battlefield is probably going to get several hundred people killed. So, you know, nobody felt like a granite or marble monument. Nobody felt like a bronze statue in July of 1863.
Yeah.
And so inherently, all of that is a little romanticized when they come back, you know, 30 years later, to remember their comrades that they lost, but also to memorialize their own actions.
That's a great way of putting it. Nobody felt like they were a bronze figure at the time. So, John, what got you interested in Civil War memory and monumentation?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so it's always been very interesting to me. I mean, you know, everybody remembers going to a Civil War battlefield for the first time, and you know, first off, your attention's probably captured by all the cannons. The cannons are pretty cool, but I guess the cannons are monuments too. I mean, especially at many battlefields, you know, the gun tubes are original from the 1860s. You know, that's a monument. But that's kind of a tangent. But the idea of like, you know, you go to a Civil War battlefield when you're a kid, you think about the cannons, but you also think about those big old monuments. And there's, you know, a million different designs of them. You know, maybe it's just a rough hewn rock with an inscription on it, or maybe it's a carving of a soldier, or maybe it's this big bronze statue of a general on a horse. And I mean, that strikes you the first time you see it. And then, you know, going through, you know, getting into college where you start complicating things a little more and start seeing some of the primary sources. And you know, I had a couple projects where I was just kind of looking at monument dedication or following soldier accounts. And as much as those soldier accounts from 1861 to 1865, I mean, they're great. Yeah, I use those plenty too. But looking at the accounts that they're writing explicitly as memoirs, I mean, I cannot get enough of the National Tribune. That Union Veterans magazine newspaper, more of, where just veterans would write in just entire columns, whether about all of their service or a particular funny story that they had or a particular battle experience. And then they would like start arguing with each other. And so there's like Union soldiers yelling at other Union soldiers that they don't remember it right. And so, you know, we think about Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers arguing about the memory of the battle or arguing about, you know, the meaning of the Civil War. And that happened. But Confederate soldiers argued with Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers argued with Union soldiers from the same unit or next to each other. You know, oh, these two regiments are brigaded with each other the whole war. And here they are 20 years after the war, and they're basically going at each other's throats, making the most passive aggressive comments you can imagine at each other, basically writing like hate mail to each other that's getting published in a magazine. And I mean, one of the chapter titles I wrote, one veteran writes about another veteran's article that it was so full of gross error that I am surprised at its publication. And these guys were on the same side next to each other on not only Gettysburg, but for more of the war. And so it really caught me. I got into monuments and memory and everything because as interesting as parsing out the actual events of the 1860s is, and that's great, and it's worthwhile, it's meaningful. There's that whole extra layer that you just got to take a look at too. I mean, if you're writing a narrative of a battle that happens in 1862, and you're putting in a bunch of sources from quotes from the 1880s, from eyewitnesses, that's great. But I mean, don't you have to at least think about like, okay, this isn't a diary entry written the day after. This isn't a letter home, which of course have their own context and, need to be thought about in a critical manner as well. But, you can't just drop that 1885 quote in without at least thinking about like, oh, why are they remembering that specific part? Why is that important to them? Why are they choosing to write about that now? And so I just think there's so many layers to looking at Civil War veterans and their writings, which is the same thing as the monument. I mean, they wrote the monument. They wrote the dedication speeches. They wrote the inscription. They chose the design. They did all of that for a reason. And unpacking that reason, it's just super interesting to me to remember that just because the Civil War is seen as being from 1861 to 1865 doesn't mean that those people didn't exist before and didn't exist after. They were people before, they were people during, and they were people after, with all of the messy bits and complications and complexities that includes.
Yeah. And I've always come at it as a writer, and I'm very interested in how stories are constructed. And so that's why memory has always been fascinating to me, because essentially when you're talking about Civil War memory, you're talking about how is the story constructed and remembered and told, and why is it told in that particular way. So the mechanics of that are fascinating to me. So that's, one reason why I find it just endlessly worth looking at and peeling back those layers and kind of getting into people's heads about it. But it also is a little frustrating to me then when people are like, oh, this is history. It's like, oh no, it's not, because as someone who's looked at how the sausage is made, and you can't unsee that, and so it gets a little frustrating for me sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the dedication speech for a monument is not rewriting history, it's just remembering what happened when the monument was put up. There are monuments that go up, and you look through those dedication speeches that are given in the 1900s, whether in the 1920s or the 1960s, there are monuments that go up where you go back through and you look up what was going on and you read the dedication speeches and you go through them and you go, oh, good Lord, because they are saying some awful, hateful things.
Yeah. In many instances,
it's not just that we think that they're awful and hateful in 2023. I mean, there are things that were awful and hateful in the 1960s too.
Yeah.
Like it's not that it's not okay to say those things now. It wasn't okay to say some of those things then either. And even if some of that was okay to say, maybe it shouldn't have been. It's just those concepts, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you raise a good point about reading the dedication speeches, which a lot of people forget about. And there's also some wonderful oration that happens in some of those speeches, and I think about Oliver Wendell Holmes in Keene, New Hampshire, when he says, in our youths, our hearts were touched by fire. Most people don't know that he said that at a monument dedication. It's so often quoted in Ken Burns, but you can find that stirring, wonderful oration, just as you can find in places just hateful, awful stuff too.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say that every time you look up a monument dedication, it's somebody saying something awful. I mean, there is just those great touching things. I mean, reading those monument dedications again. I've mostly read Union regimental monument dedications that bring this to mind, where it's these guys coming out and they've brought their wives, they brought their children. I mean, in some cases, they're carting out their grandkids, and they're coming out here with whatever's left of their regimental buddies. And they're telling stories around a campfire the night before. I mean, literally, they're holding like these big bonfire campfires. And then the next day, they're going out on this battlefield where I'm thinking of some examples that I'm used to, like the 130th Pennsylvania at Antietam, where they have these big events. And then, I mean, they're all processing this even 20, 30 years later. And then they're giving these beautiful speeches at the dedication about, the monument and why they chose the design and why they chose to put it where they put it there, and what it means to them as surviving veterans, and what it means to them to remember not only the people that were lost in the battle, but also everybody that they've lost in between, everybody that has died of maybe war wounds, maybe an accident, maybe just old age, because it's no longer 1865 where they're coming home. It's 1885, it's 1893, it's 1904, it's 1919. Things have changed, and you've probably lost a lot of your friends that maybe made it out of that battlefield with you. And so there is just, that beautiful oration, which offers you that insight into what those battles and what the war meant to those veterans. And again, I mean, it's such a great source. We can learn so much about the war, about individuals, and about the late 1800s. We can learn so much about everything that's going on through Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction era by just taking a look and seeing how they're thinking about things and how they're processing these events. And sometimes, yeah, we get that beautiful oratory that gets slapped on Ken Burns and burned into everybody's brains. I was recently at the Ken Burns Film Festival in Gettysburg, and seeing some of the Ken Burns episode, in a movie theater, a historic movie theater on the big screen. I mean, it just really burns all that stuff right back into you, just like when you watched it for the first time and you heard Oliver Wendell Holmes or everybody else and all those famous quotes and narrators.
Yeah. Well, and I think your larger point, go back to the primary sources, go back to the original documentation, and you will be surprised at what you learn, good and bad, about some of the monuments. And it really is a case by case thing. And it's a wonderful opportunity to really enrich your own context when you look at those monuments by looking at what the people said at those dedications. So about the book, what else have we not talked about the book that you want to touch on tonight? Because I know this is in many ways your baby.
Well, one thing with how you're talking about primary sources, I mean, we put that, right in the editor's note about the idea that all of our authors, they're approaching these things from different angles. All of the authors have different backgrounds, so they're looking at monuments differently. Some are writing about monuments in their hometown. Some are writing about monuments on a battlefield that they've written a book on. And so, everybody's coming at it from their own angle, their own cultural understanding, their own layers, their own decisions. And we've got a lot of different perspectives. But what we put in the editor's note was that in addition to all of those perspectives, we made sure that everybody, had done their homework. All of these articles are based off of the primary sources. Nobody's making any of this up. And even as you go along in the book, we've got all the footnotes and they're on the same page, right? So if you read a quote from a monument dedication and you think that's really cool, or I want to know more about that, I mean, right at the bottom of the page, you're going to have the whole footnote information for, whatever book or archive, the author pulled this out of. It's all right there, because this isn't just the authors coming up with stuff and putting it down on a page. It's everything here is based on primary sources, whether it's the monument themselves, the dedication, all of that, it's all just right here for any reader to look at and want to learn more about, or learn how to research monuments for their own, so that they can go out and go like, I want to learn the history of my town's monument, and here's how these authors did it, here's how I can do it. So I just wanted to jump into that while we were on the topic of primary sources, that they're all just they're right there for you.
Yeah. So as you were pulling this together, was there an essay that you discovered that surprised you or gave you something that just was completely unexpected?
Yeah. Oh, I've every time, everybody who's watching the video of this keeps seeing me like look down because I am just, constantly flipping back through this and the table of contents and some of my written notes and sticky notes and everything. And I'm remembering, my big old Excel spreadsheet and Word document as I tried to parse out like, oh, I like this. I like this. Oh, I got to talk to this author because it'd be really good if we could add some context about this. So, I'm trying to think, like I said, those articles that we included about non-traditional monuments. I really think that that's a really special section of the book. The idea of looking at a sugar kettle in front of a historic plantation, looking at the name of a city, looking at, a tree, looking at veterans themselves as forms of monuments. I mean, that I think is just a really unique add to this discussion about it, because they're different. They're not granite or marble or bronze, but they're nevertheless, really important to it.
Now, as we started working on the book, and as we were trying to figure out what falls under the umbrella of memory, and this book has a focus on monuments and different sorts of monuments. But because we had so much content, there's a second book coming that also engages in memory through the lens of pop culture, which is kind of another way of remembering the Civil War. Give us a little preview about what people might expect when the pop culture book arrives.
Oh, that one is exciting, and we're still chugging away at that one, but it is coming in the near-ish approximate future. But there's all kinds of stuff, whereas here we're talking mostly about written sources or monuments. The pop culture book is kind of everything else, books, music, both historic music and contemporary music, movies. Look at lots of good stuff on movies. Board games, video games. I mean, all of that is represented in there to some extent, because they're all ways in which people are engaging with the Civil War and engaging with the memory of the Civil War, and how they're thinking about the war, and how the people who created that art are thinking about the war, and how the people that engage with that art are thinking about the war. So they're definitely companion volumes, and not just because we started putting them together and realized we had too much stuff for one book.
So hopefully you'll be able to read both of those in conversation with each other when they're both out. As a hint, Dwight Hughes has been kind enough to index these last few volumes, and so he's finishing up the index now. And when he does, this will be off to the printer by the end of, or by the middle of April, I'm guessing. So coming soon to a bookstore near you, thanks to Savage Painting. So John, anything I haven't asked you tonight that I should have asked you?
No, I think we just about touched everything, and of course, getting the plug in for the pop culture volume was good thinking on your part.
Very good. Well, I want to just close by saying what a privilege it was to work on the book with you. I learned a lot and deepened my own understanding about monuments and memory by having the opportunity to work with you on this volume, and I just really appreciate the insight and the thoughtfulness that you brought to this book.
Thanks, Chris. Couldn't have done it without you, and the fact that you had all of the experience getting through everything, going from from me having my Excel spreadsheet of I like all of these pieces and I would like to approach these authors about writing these pieces, and then going to you and being like, all right, I got this Excel spreadsheet. I don't know where we go from here. I don't know how we get from this list of articles and wish list articles to, this. Yeah. And that was, obviously Chris had input, of course, into choosing the articles and helping edit and revise things. But he was very much the invaluable co-editor, as the person who actually knew how the system worked.
Well, hopefully this is the first of many great collaborations and many more great projects for you, John. So,
all right, thanks, Chris.
Thanks for being with us, folks. On behalf of my colleague, John Tracey, I'm Chris Mackowski in the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online and on the battlefield.